The Civil War was one of the deadliest wars fought on American territory. Much of the South was left in ruin. Many were injured, and even more captured soldiers were taken into prison camps. The impacts left on prisoners of Camp Butler and Rock Island were high death rates due to horrible conditions such as weather, diseases, need of treatment, and overcrowded situations.
During the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, seven southern states, including South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, had left from the United States, forming the Confederacy. On April 12, 1861, the Confederacy fired the opening shots of the American Civil War. Victory and losses were beginning to take place. Prisoners were starting to become captive. Out of some 3.8 million soldiers in the Civil War, over 4,000 were at some point taken prisoners. When prisoner exchanges were suspended in 1864, prison camps grew larger and more numerous. Camps like Camp Butler and Rock Island prisons began to increase in size, and problems began to emerge. In Rock Island, the first group of prisoners were around 470, and by the end of the month, the prison population would exceed 5,000 captured Confederate soldiers. With not enough space, both Union trained guards and Confederate prisoners shared same housing because not enough space was provided. Without being separated, they all had the same living conditions. Then in Camp Butler it established military training camps for the Union soldiers. Later also became prison camp for Confederate soldiers. During the Civil War, it was named after the infamous William Butler during the war. Camp Butler housed the largest number of men, while more than 200,000 men spent time there for one reason or another.
Terrible conditions affected the prisoners. High death rates were due to the lack of food, clothing, sanitation, and shelter for the high volume of prisoners. Disease was the chief killer during the war, taking 2 men for everyone who died of battle wounds. Camps were plagued with pneumonia, cholera, smallpox, dysentery, malaria, and other diseases spurred by close contact, poor nutrition, and inadequate clothing and housing. The prison was an infestation for diseases brought by soldiers. These diseases, these diseases made high death rates at camp. Approximately 700 prisoners died during the smallpox epidemic in Camp Butler, and more than 950 Confederate soldiers died in Rock Island. The brutal winters and intense summers contributed to more deaths. This weather weakened the immune systems of the already poorly handled prisoners. Unfamiliar weather conditions during the transportation process, soldiers were infected. The brutal winter contributed to the lice and typhus infestations, and rapid spread of diseases killed population of the camps. The winter of 1862 proved to be one of the harshest winters encountered during the Civil War. Prisoners were not yet ready, and there was not enough space for the men to be accommodated. The first troops that arrived at Camp Butler in early August 1861. By the end of the month, more than 5,000 prisoners were located at Camp Butler. Foot soldiers and cavalry were as well being trained at Camp Butler, and on December 1863, the yet unfinished Rock Island prison received its first prisoners who had been captured by General Ulysses S. Grant. The prisoners who were ill upon arrival created a strong need for hospitals and medical treatment only several weeks into camp's existence. There also seemed to be a need for the addition of more hospitals to be used as fever hospitals. Many of the hospitals in this small camp were segregated by the prognosis of and diagnosis. Also, within 2.5 weeks, over 148 prisoners had died due to poor health conditions. The death rate at Camp Butler averaged around 3 to 4 soldiers per day, and on some days the death toll reached to 15 men. Added to the problem, the plan was to build 84 barracks with each one housing 120 prisoners along with their own kitchen. The stockade fence was 12 feet high. There was a sentry placed every 100 feet with only two openings to get inside. The site included barracks, training and parade grounds, stables, and officer quarters. Prisoners made elaborate escape plans by tunneling under the prison wall.
The short term effects of the prison camps were the cemeteries. For example, the Rock Island Confederate Cemetery was established in 1864, located 1,000 yards southeast of the prison. In March 1864, the remains of 671 Confederate prisoners' dead bodies were reburied in the new burial grounds. Approximately 1,950 Confederate prisoners were buried in the cemetery, with the last burial occurring on July 11, 1865, at Camp Butler out of an estimate of 5,178 Confederate soldiers held as prisoners of war. 866 Confederate graves were found around. 203 escaped, and 339 number of Confederate soldiers took an oath of allegiance to secure their loyalty to their country. The long-term effects of the prison camps left for today are many cemeteries for the deceased. Camp Butler's National Cemetery honored their sacrifice along with Union troops. There are 866 Confederate graves making up a separate section of Camp Butler. Then, in Rock Island Confederate Cemetery, the only surviving massive prison camp that once held thousands of Confederate soldiers, is now located near the southeast corner of Arsenal Island in Rock Island, Illinois. The Confederacy Cemetery is the final resting place for nearly 2,000 prisoners.
The influence left on prisoners of these camps were harsh conditions of weather, diseases, need of treatment, poor housing, and overcrowded amounts of prisoners and soldiers. Due to these death rates, the chances of death was very high, averaged around 3 to 4 soldiers per day, and on some days higher numbers. Poor health conditions increased the chances of death. These prisoners needed more medical and sanitary assistance, which could not be provided to them. They couldn't afford these specific needs at the camps during the war.